When we talk about suffering, when we attempt to diagnose the root of prolonged dysfunction, of entrenched injustice, it's tempting to look for a single villain, a scapegoat, something tidy, something ideologically satisfying. And nowhere is that temptation more pronounced than in the case of Africa. The continent, rich in history, culture, and potential, has often been reduced to a caricature of victim. The narrative goes, Africa is poor because of colonization, because of the European empires, because of white men in pith helmets. And while it's true, utterly true, that colonization wrought devastation, theft, and humiliation, it is also dangerously incomplete, even dishonest, to assert that it is the sole or even primary reason for Africa's ongoing economic struggles today. Because if we continue to locate the source of Africa's pain solely in its colonial past, then we rob its people of responsibility. And when you rob people of responsibility, you rob them of agency, of meaning, of power. You infantilize them. And that, whether done out of guilt or pride, is the most condescending form of racism. Africa is not poor because of colonization. That era ended decades ago. And now, if we're going to speak truthfully, courageously, and redemptively, we need to confront deeper, more uncomfortable truths. Truths that involve culture, corruption, tribalism, education, family structures, and moral philosophy. The first, and perhaps most difficult truth to confront, is the matter of responsibility. There's a profound psychological distinction between being hurt and being helpless. The past can hurt you, it can wound you terribly, but it cannot make your decisions for you in the present. And the continued tendency to explain Africa's poverty solely through the lens of historical colonization traps the continent in an identity of victimhood. That mindset is insidious. It tells individuals and nations alike, you are not capable. You are not to blame, and if you are not to blame, then you are not to act. But meaning in life emerges when you accept voluntary responsibility for the burdens you did not choose. That is where maturity begins. Africa has been independent for more than half a century. If colonization were the sole determinant of poverty, then nations like India or Singapore or Vietnam, each with brutal colonial pasts, would also be languishing. But they're not. Why? Because post-independence decisions matter. Leadership matters. Rule of law matters. Corruption, or the refusal to confront it, matters. And it is an act of courage, not condemnation, to acknowledge that, because only when a society accepts that its future is in its own hands does it begin to build the institutions necessary for prosperity. Blaming colonialism for Africa's current poverty is not only historically lazy, it's morally dangerous. It paralyzes initiative. It rewards grievance over growth. It empowers corrupt elites who know they can always deflect criticism outward rather than reform inward. Second, we must examine the structure of governance and the character of leadership across post-colonial African states. After independence, many African nations fell prey not to foreign empires, but to homegrown tyranny. Dictators, warlords, and ideologically possessed rulers replaced colonial governors, often replicating the same extractive systems, only now without external accountability. And these leaders, many of them Marxist-influenced, centralized power, decimated private enterprise, and used state violence to crush dissent. This is not the legacy of colonization. This is the result of conscious political choices made by post-colonial elites. And to conflate the two is to deny history its nuance and moral clarity. Leadership is not just about seizing power. It's about the hard, often thankless work of institution building, of upholding contracts, of defending private property, of ensuring a functional judiciary. And where African nations have succeeded in these areas, think Botswana, Rwanda, Ghana, they have begun to flourish. Where they have failed, due to tribalism, corruption, or authoritarianism, they have languished. That is not a European conspiracy. That is a cultural and political crisis. And until we are willing to hold African leaders to the same standards of accountability that we demand of others, we are not helping, we are enabling decay. Third, the role of culture must be wrestled with even though it's uncomfortable. Because culture isn't just dance or language or fashion. Culture is a set of values, often unspoken, that guide behavior, that shape expectations, that determine how societies view time, truth, work, family, and education. And if certain cultural norms encourage short-term thinking, tribal loyalty over institutional trust, or a fatalistic belief in fate rather than agency, then poverty will persist. Regardless of how much foreign aid is sent, time orientation, societies that think long-term, where parents save for their children's future, where businesses plan across decades, tend to generate stable wealth. Societies that are dominated by present-oriented thinking, by immediate gratification, struggle to build lasting prosperity. These patterns are not racial, they are not fixed, but they are cultural and they are changeable. Just as Japan transformed itself after defeat, just as South Korea rebuilt from ruins, so too can African nations cultivate a culture of responsibility, excellence, and delayed gratification. But not if the dominant narrative tells them that everything bad is someone else's fault. Cultural reform is painful, but it is essential. Because you cannot build a high-trust, high-skill, high-number society on a foundation of blame and dependency. You must build it on truth, effort, and the willingness to sacrifice today for the hope of tomorrow. Fittingly, we must scrutinize the role of foreign aid and its often unintended consequences. Aid, when used strategically, can be a bridge to development, but when it becomes a permanent fixture, a substitute for local initiative rather than a supplement, it produces learned helplessness. It corrodes the very entrepreneurial spirit that lifts people out of poverty. And this is precisely what has happened in many parts of Africa. The flood of donor money, often with no strings attached, has created an economy of dependence. Entire bureaucracies exist not to serve the people, but to appease foreign donors. Corruption flourishes not in spite of aid, but because of it. Leaders are incentivized to maintain the image of crisis because crisis attracts cash. Meanwhile, local businesses can't compete with free imports. Civil society is weakened, and worst of all, the people themselves begin to believe that their fate lies not in their hands, but in the generosity of outsiders. This is not empowerment, it's slow-motion erosion. If we truly care about Africa's prosperity, we must stop treating it like a child in need of rescue. We must challenge it to rise, to build, to reform, to innovate, to govern itself with integrity. That is not harsh, that is dignity, and dignity, not pity, is the only soil in which true prosperity can grow.